case, hopefully no, but in case there's an earthquake or a fire, there are two exits there and one just here. And the one that is closest, please go. But this UNAM campus is very secure, so there's no problem, hopefully. Well, so let me start to present our plenary speaker, Dr. Francisco Galindo. Dr. Francisco Galindo got his degree as a vet at UNAM, at the Faculty of Veterinary UNAM, and got his PhD at the University of Cambridge. He's a full-time professor at the Ethology Department and Wildlife, and he was the chief of the head of the Department of Ethology and one of he actually was the first to create this department after he finished his PhD. He also did some research fellowship at the Says Holland at the Animal Production Department and the University of Cambridge. He also founded the Mexican Society of Ethology and Welfare and coordinated the projects he was the general coordinator of the projects for the International Fund for Animal Welfare for the Latin American office from 2002 to 2010. He's also a member of the National Research System and he's one of the coordinators for Mexico, and actually the OIE, which is the Animal Health organization, and the office is based at the vet school in UNAM, and there are it is in collaboration with also research centers in Uruguay and Chile, so he coordinates this in Mexico. He has published more than 60 papers and also been involved with it as an editor of 2 books and wrote more than 11 chapters of other books. But most important, he's one of the most active and productive researchers on animal welfare in Mexico and Latin America, and the best mentor and good friend for a lot of us that we are students. So please welcome Dr. Francisco Galindo.
Hello, thank you gracias Eduardo, thank you very much. Welcome everyone to Mexico and welcome also everyone to this university, UNAM. It's a great pleasure to be here. I would like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me, and in particular my friend Beatriz Banda. I don't know if she's over here, but anyway, I would like to thank her for inviting me and be able to have the opportunity of talking to you about a multidisciplinary approach that we have been carrying out in relation to animal welfare agenda. We started working on animal welfare research in the university something like 20 years ago, and we found that at the end it was easier to talk about animal welfare as an integrated agenda, as part of the sustainability criteria. So we have been carrying out this approach, especially in the south of Mexico and also in some other Latin American countries. So the idea is precisely to talk about this concept of one welfare, integrating animal welfare with other issues, social issues, environmental issues. And the structure of the presentation is basically to talk about some of the background information on these topics, specifically on the challenges we have ahead in relation to a global agenda, and then to talk specifically about the scientific basis of animal welfare as part of the sustainability criteria, specifically on measurements, how we can sort of develop new indicators, reliable indicators, and also be able to measure trade-offs in different systems. And at the end, basically to talk about a study case in the south of Mexico as an example of how we are integrating these type of criteria and measurements, and some few reflections, comments at the end on the work ahead on this sort of one welfare agenda. But I'm sure that this is not new for most of you about the estimations of the world population growth that is being estimated as 9 billion in 2050, and since 2005, FAO estimated also how the trends on the per capita consumption of livestock products will increase. In particularly in relation to income in Asian countries, and also in relation to some cultural trends in different regions. And doesn't mean that it will stop in 2050. I mean, the trends will continue, and the increase on consumption of livestock product will continue up to 2050. And basically, because of some issues like this one, this is a graph showing how the increase of animal products are related to the increase of income, and also how, in relation to this increase of income, there's a decrease on the consumption of vegetable products, or things are related to foodstuff are tending to increase in relation to income. And in particular, in relation to meat consumption, there's also some trends, interesting trends. This is a graph showing the trends from 2013 to 2022, basically showing that from here up, this is the quantity of consumption per capita of meat, and basically showing that all of these type of products like poultry, beef, this is beef, the blue one, pigs, sheep, tend to increase in this period of time. But in relation to how this will be distributed, it seems that poultry is the type of product that will increase more also in this interval. This means that in relation to animal welfare, we are talking about more individuals being slaughtered in relation to this type of trend. So it could be a very serious animal welfare issue or implications in the long term. So basically, in response to this type of trends of demand, of increase of demand in animal products, we are facing several challenges worldwide which are very, very serious and very urgent to tackle. Of course, in relation to the environment, it is well known how several types of livestock production systems, not just extensive systems, but also intensive systems, are related to both deforestation and loss of biodiversity, and basically this relates to the loss of ecosystem services in different types of areas of the world. Loss of clean water, loss of clean air, loss of soil, and other types of services. And at the same time, both extensive systems, because of this deforestation, are related to an increase in the emissions of gases, greenhouse gases, as well as systems that are related to intensive production, but are also associated to the pollution of water, pollution, and the type of use of land on monoculture type of systems. So we're talking about a sort of negative balance of gases that being captured or at the same time emitted that poses a very important challenge in relation to future type of livestock systems. This is not the only challenge, of course. We're also talking about very serious social issues, specifically in areas where these type of systems are also related to the loss of biodiversity. We're talking about social problems in communities close to areas of conservation. An example is all the tropics, all the sort of tropical area of Latin America, south of Mexico, Central America, north of South America, that still communities that are involved in sort of traditional type of production are not being benefited by the trends that we have now at the moment of huge and extensive production systems. We still have a lot of poverty and associated to that malnutrition that are related to the incidence of disease that definitely has to be tackled together with environmental issues as well as with animal welfare issues. Everyone is aware about the type of animal welfare problems that we are facing in relation to extensive systems and also in relation to intensive systems. We still have a very high incidence and prevalence of infectious diseases, such as viral diseases, bacterial diseases in pig production. In relation to dairy cattle, we are facing serious welfare problems in relation to the incidence of mastitis, for example, or the incidence of lameness, the incidence of infectious diseases, all associated to this type of housing and facilities. In relation to feedlots, the main problem has to do with respiratory problems and also to infectious diseases and heat stress. Also in relation to poultry and other types of intensive systems in birds, infectious diseases is really, really high. In relation to extensive systems, many people say, well, they are much better and they have to face less challenges, cattle in these types of extensive systems, but it's not true. basically because of the type of systems that are related to a high incidence of heat stress and also to parasitic diseases. And of course, also in relation to management procedures, handling procedures that are related to acute stress and also to health and welfare problems associated to these painful and more invasive procedures. So definitely we have a lot of animal welfare issues to tackle at the same time. So what to do? What to do with these challenges in relation to the increase of demand of animal products? Well, FAO, something like 10 years ago, released a publication with some basic recommendations that are summarized basically in these 3 bullets. One recommendation, general recommendation, is to measure externalities of these different types of animal production systems. An example, we have an area in Mexico in the state of Michoacán, which is central Mexico, that is sort of famous because of the pig production systems that we have over there. This is from the 50s, 60s. A lot of efforts were put into developing these sort of pig farms in the area of La Piedad, Michoacán. And it was an area full of forests and full of rivers. And if you see things, 20 or 30 years afterwards, the incidence of infectious diseases in people and also the incidence of many diseases in children and people in relation to the pollution of the rivers is really, really high. So when they decided to put these pig farms there, no one measured the externality on the environment or the externality on human health. So this is a type of things that have to be included in these measurements of externalities. And as part of the externality, we are talking about animal welfare. Animal welfare is an externality of different systems, and we need to include this in the production costs in the future. At the same time, well, in relation to the type of use of resources, a recommendation is to intensify the type of use that we are doing of resources. This is not related to intensification of systems or to intensive systems. It's more intensification of the type of use of land. So we're talking about sustainable livestock intensification or agricultural intensification, but in relation to sort of the ecology of landscape and the type of resources being used to produce this type of products. But at the same time, by reducing adverse effects on community, on poverty, on animal welfare, of course, and on the environment, especially in relation to pollution. So that's a huge challenge ahead. And in the case of extensive systems, the basic recommendation is related to transform extensive systems into grazing systems that are associated with the provision of environmental services. So this is where we think we need to work a lot in these tropical areas, basically because we have most of the cattle production in areas where we have lost a lot of the forests, a lot of biodiversity, and that we still are facing these social challenges ahead. So basically these are 3 general recommendations that have been translated into global agendas, into global policy in relation to what the World Health Organization is saying, FAO, and also the World Animal Health Organization, the OIE. So as a response to these type of challenges, we have been working on the integration precisely on the different agendas in relation to social needs, in relation to food safety issues, to animal welfare, basically focusing on animal needs, biological needs, and of course also in relation to environmental services. Being able to measure or identify reliable indicators of each of these criteria, and at the same time being able to develop tools to measure trade-offs and synergies between these different indicators. Now, in relation to animal welfare, I would like to just point out some sort of basic background on how we should focus the type of indicators of measurements on animal welfare in order to be able to fit these criteria of these sustainability tools with good indicators or biological indicators of animal welfare. As you probably know, Ian Duncan from Guelph University and David Fraser from British Columbia University some years ago published a paper, that was a review paper, and it was their opinion on how they see or how they perceive that animal welfare, or the concept of animal welfare, is seen across different groups in society. And basically they summarize this in this diagram, saying that there's a sector, there's a group of people in society that give more importance to affective states when they talk about animal welfare. but at the same time there are groups that go more to indicators in relation to the biological functioning of the animal. This is more in relation to animal husbandry because they focus more on topics like health, feeding issues, physiological indicators, reproductive or productive performance. No? But there are also other groups that perceive animal welfare as that we should go something to more natural type of environments for the animals and emphasize on the biology of behavior, precisely on which are the behaviors that are important biologically. Sometimes there are some conflicts in relation to how this is perceived or how they relate, but in reality, there shouldn't be any conflict at all, because mental states, affective states, is part of the biology of the animal, is part of a evolutionary trait of the animal, and it should be seen, the mental states and sentience, as part of the biological functioning. And of course, this is related to the possibility of expressing behaviors that are biologically important. So we need just to find the link between the possibility of an animal to be able to express natural behavior and behaviors that are important for the welfare, that are related to ideally positive states of the animal, positive mental states, and of course in relation to how this relates to physiological responses and health. So, as a background of this, going back some years ago, and how animal behavior studies have been the basis for the science of animal welfare, in a way permits or allows to be able to begin to link this type of topics, biology of mental states, physiology, health. The origin, in a way, of the concept of animal welfare that is being used as part of the global agenda of OIE comes from the basis of animal behavior studies, basically by linking both the approach of ethologists that were interested in looking at the function of the behavior and the evolution of behavior, together with an approach that is more proximal, has more to do with the immediate cause of a behavior being expressed and the way this behavior can be learned and changed during the life of the individual. So basically, these aspects that can be studied in a pattern of behavior are related to two concepts that are widely used in relation to animal welfare. One is the motivation of behavior. What is the motivational system that is saying that animal to express that particular behavior, and in the context that has to be expressed, and also the concept of adaptive value, how important that behavioral trait has been for the survival of the species. And they are both linked. I mean, the concept of motivation and the concept of adaptive value are both important to know more about proximal causes and more ultimate causes, and at the same time being able to define animal welfare in these terms, in terms of biological needs and biological importance. An example of how to measure this type of concept, how to measure motivation, has been the comparison of behaviors of species in the wild, and then compare that to the same species in captivity. And this has been useful, especially in wildlife species, but also has been very useful in domestic animals, using feral groups of animals as models to understand which is that behavior that has been inherited and that biologically can be important for the species. One example is a study by Stephen Hall. Stephen Hall worked for a long time in Shillingham, in the central part of England, and did some other studies in the north of the UK, looking at feral cattle. And he found that regardless of where he was doing his observations, he always saw that subgroups of between 40 and 60 individuals were formed. And then eventually some studies, especially in the Netherlands, found in stables, in intensive systems, that the groups that can form a hierarchy and being stable socially in less than 24 hours were those that were grouped exactly in groups of 40 and 60 individuals. And, well, with most studies eventually, it seems has to do with individual recognition of cows. And the advantage of being able to recognize other individuals in a group is precisely to be able to form a stable hierarchy, a stable group that finally relates to less aggression and to less stress and to less diseases in relation to stress, considering these biological traits. So that's an example of how feral animals can be used eventually to know more about biological needs. Another approach has been doing more controlled tests, like preference testing, designing experiments to be able to the animal select or choose of those important resources. And one recent example is this study by Kendrick in Baberham, near Cambridge, that also through preference testing, he was able to see how sheep, in this case, select images of calm and smiling persons rather than images of angry or expressions that are sort of related to negative type of emotions. At the same time, the sheep select those images of conspecifics that also express sort of positive emotions or positive facial expressions. This is really interesting because, in fact, these type of indicators have now been incorporated into practical assessment protocols, such as a WIN. I want to talk later about those. But the idea is to also precisely to be able to identify indicators that can be also used in practice. Okay, in a way, this background, the possibility of being able to measure this type of behaviors, to measure motivation, is allowing us to select those behaviors that are more important biologically. And it is in these terms that the concept of animal welfare has been adopted by the World Animal Health Organization. This is a definition that was proposed some time ago by Don Broom in Cambridge, and OAE in 2007 formed a group of experts and decided to adopt this sort of definition. Basically, this definition has to do with defining animal welfare as a relative term, being able to define welfare in a range of good and poor welfare, and being able to select indicators, reliable indicators that can tell us which is the success or the failure of the animal in coping with that environment when they have to face these challenges. This, in a way, has been adopted by OAE because an absolute term of animal welfare is really difficult to define. An absolute term of animal welfare in any species, in our species, is something that is changeable, and it relates to how the individual has failure or success in coping with different problems. And the type of indicators that have been sort of integrating and developing in relation to this approach are related also to what we have been saying before, related to sentience, to mental states. No? This is a biological trait. The capability of feeling, of showing feelings and expressing feelings. And of course, this relates to changes in behavior and to changes in the physiology, basically in relation to all these biological systems that respond to the environment, stress and pain. No? Behavior, for example, if the animal is capable of showing these preferred behaviors, or if it's capable of showing these behaviors that are biologically important, or in the other range, in relation to poor welfare, if the animal develops pathologies of behavior. In relation to stress, basically, to measure the activity of different axes related to acute type of responses or chronic type of responses in relation to challenges. And this is a small announcement. This is the logo of the International Society for Applied Ethology, as Eduardo was saying. This is the ISAE. This is a scientific society that was formed in 1966 in response basically to the Bramwell Committee in the UK, and still, I think, gathers most of the people doing research on animal welfare. We are hoping that the ISAE and the OAE can collaborate more, because most of the experts that are working in the ad hoc groups, in the specialist groups in OAE, basically come from groups related to the ISAE agenda. So just in case you are interested in knowing more about this society, you can access all the abstracts, all the proceedings of conferences in the 1970s in the ISAE webpage. And more recently, using all this scientific information that is already published, there are a lot of scientific journals on animal welfare. The sort of recommendation also of international organizations is to develop practical assessment protocols for people that are in charge directly or responsible of the animals, or for producers. And these are two examples of scientific studies that were basically carried out in order to develop this type of protocols. Welfare quality was coordinated in the Netherlands, in Wageningen University, and a WIN was coordinated in the University of Edinburgh. Both of them are integrating very practical, very simple ways to record issues on behavior, on animal-based sort of indicators, behavior and health, and also in relation to the environment, to housing and feeding. And these are two examples of, I think, the way to go forward in relation to practical assessment on animal welfare based on science. And in relation to how this science, as how this sort of information is being used for global policy, well, you know, OAI. OAI is maintains the acronym in French, but it's the World Animal Health Organization. I think it's probably the intergovernmental organization with an animal welfare agenda that is probably the biggest international organization with an animal welfare agenda. There are more than 180 countries now, members of OAI, and basically OAI works through regional representations and receives support from collaborating centers in order to be able to carry out this agenda, to implement recommendations. Of all the collaborating centers in OAI, in 20 countries, most of them are animal health collaborating centers. There are now 4 collaborating centers on animal welfare. One of them is in Italy. This was the first collaborating center for OAI in Italy and works basically on issues related to companion animals and to epidemiology. A group of universities in Australia and New Zealand working on bioethics and working also on laboratory animals and livestock production as well. We have a collaborating center in Chile, Uruguay, and Mexico. It's a joint collaborating center for the agenda on the Americas. And recently there was a new collaborating center was approved in Washington, basically focusing on laboratory animals. These are examples of collaborating centers that are supporting regionally the agenda, the global agenda of OAI. And this global agenda, in a way, is based on recommendations that are made by specialists all over the world, and they are published in the different codes of recommendation, the terrestrial code and the aquatic code, specifically on animal welfare. And all this, in a way, makes sense, basically because the agenda, the OAI agenda and the recommendations are also being drafted in relation to this global agenda on one welfare or one health. The concept of one welfare, in a way, I think, is sort of derives from the concept of one health, no? By integrating public health issues, environmental health, or eco-health, and of course, animal health. And in a way, one welfare concept intends to do the same, intends to develop indicators that can allow us to integrate animal welfare measurements together with social benefits, no? in the communities related especially to livestock production, and of course in relation to the provision of environmental services. So in a way, I believe that the one health and one welfare concepts are really much related. And of course, this sort of one welfare agenda goes back again to the same criteria that I was mentioning before, the possibility of measuring trade-offs and synergies between different indicators of these different dimensions or criteria. So, as an example of how we are trying to integrate this type of topics or measurements, I would like to talk to you about this study case we're carrying out in the peninsula of Yucatan. The peninsula of Yucatan is integrated by 3 states, Quintana Roo, Yucatan, Campeche, and south of Chiapas as well. And basically, the idea is to integrate measurements on landscape structure, no? Basically focusing on environmental services and biodiversity, on animal welfare and productivity, biodiversity and how it relates to the occurrence of disease, and also to greenhouse gases, nutrition, and climate change. The initial approach is to select areas that are, as a model, contrast the way that resources are being used. And this is a model developed by Andrew Balmford in the Department of Zoology in the University of Cambridge, basically contrasting land sharing against land sparing type of use. No? What is better for the environment? To have an area that is perceived as sort of wildlife friendly, or an area that can be sort of concentrated to more production in a more intensified way, and be able to preserve some areas, no, that can relate to perhaps more communities, more populations for wildlife. So this is something that Cambridge has been trying to do for the last 10 years, no, to see which is the best sort of model, no, land sparing against land sharing. But we are talking here about scales, about 20-kilometer scales of landscape. What we are trying to do is, with considering this gradient of landscape ecology or landscape structure, at the same time select different production units in these landscapes that are related to different landscape in the production unit. And basically, an example of this is these intensive silvopastoral systems that have been used in several countries in Latin America, particularly in Colombia, Brazil, Costa Rica, and now Mexico, in the south of Mexico. And intensive silvopastoral systems is basically a sort of paddock that considers three structures of vegetation, trees and live fences, as we call them. Is basically trees divided into different paddocks, legume and shrubs. No, it's a very good source of protein, and a lot of native plants of legumes that are really, really sort of important also for the type of nutrition that is associated with the emission of gases. I'm going to tell you more about this. And of course, grass. No? So this is, in a way, a system that we want to contrast with other type of grazing systems in this design. Basically, we have been comparing different type of measurements in monoculture grazing systems, intensive silvopastoral systems, and what we call the native silvopastoral systems, which is basically the monte, as we call it in Spanish, or the forest, where a lot of poor communities still live there, close to these areas, and where they have cattle and their animals grazing in this type of landscapes. Once we have been able to measure different indicators at different scales and basically focusing on the environment and the animals, we are integrating that into different tools that allow us to quantify these indicators and be able to measure more trade-offs between these dimensions, as I was saying before. An example of these tools is the life cycle assessment tool. Life cycle assessment is a methodology that allows us to identify sort of the hot spots of on environmental impact of a production process, any type of production process. Life cycle assessment is a methodology that was used for this publication by FAO on the livestock's long shadow. I don't know if you're aware of that publication, but anyway, it's a tool that is being used a lot to compare also different sectors, the energetic sector with the livestock production sector, with other industries. Another example is MESMIS. MESMIS is a tool that was developed by a research group of this university in a campus in Morelia. Omar Macera has been very successful in using it as part of the sustainability measurement of agricultural systems. And also the SAFA protocols. SAFA protocols are developed by FAO. Those are more recent, more focusing on production units, not necessarily on systems, on big landscapes, but also very, very useful in the ways different indicators have been used for this sort of more integral type of approach. Examples of the different measurements and indicators that we have been using in relation to animal behavior. This is a graph showing the proportion of heifers that are foraging in two types of systems, the monoculture and the silvopastoral systems. And these lines here is how, according to the time of the day and to temperature and humidity being increased, how the behavior of animals change completely. You see, in the silvopastoral systems, cattle basically, at the times of more heat, decided to rest, and they select the times for feeding in comparison to the monoculture systems that, regardless of the temperature and humidity, they look for food more frequently. Of course, the energetic waste is huge. In relation to social behavior, this is a comparison of non-agonistic interactions or affiliative interactions, which is a very good indicator of socio-positive interactions. And basically, the comparison between two systems show that there are more affiliative type of interactions for cattle, non-agonistic interactions in silvopastoral systems. That has to do also with the microclimate of these type of systems, and cattle are closer and they sort of leak more often, and this allows more sort of more cohesion, no, in the group. Using these welfare quality protocols, we used an indicator of these protocols that has to do with human-animal interactions, basically in relation to flight zone, the distance, no, when an animal reacts to the presence of the person, of the human, and there's a very, very strong relationship between tree coverage and this type of microclimate with the possibility of animals approaching humans. They have less fear, no, to the persons in the type of silvopastoral systems than in the sort of monoculture systems where they do not approach the person. And they can be sort of, they behave like companion animals, really, the cattle. In relation to some physiological indicators, this is the comparison also of both systems. This is in the rainy season, in the dry season. And this is a photograph of, with a thermographic camera of the skin, and basically compares the type of the temperature in the skin of the cow in both systems. This is an example of the photographs that are taken. You see, this is the monoculture systems, no, in comparison to the silvopastoral system. This is when the animals are in the paddock. In the south of Mexico, animals stay in the paddock from 5, 6 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. After 5, they are taken to pens. And our student, Adelis, also measured these thermography images when the animals go back from the paddock to the pen, and 2 hours after they go to the pen, temperatures are still really, really high in animals that were grazing in the paddocks of the monoculture system. So it tells us a lot about this energetic waste, no, and the heat stress that our animals are facing. This is a comparison also between these two systems, rainy season, dry season, of the respiratory rate of cows. The normal respiratory rate of cows is more or less 40 respirations per minute. If you see, all of them, all are above the normal respiratory rate. But if you see the monoculture systems in dry season, is double, no, the normal rate for the animals. So it can tell you a lot about stress as well. Okay, in relation to biodiversity, I'm not going to go into in a lot of detail, but again, comparing the different landscape in production units, this is the species richness. This is the number of species found, no, in one place, and of course you see this is richness of birds, of bats, and rodents in 3 production units. And well, there's a clear difference, no? And very, very similar, the silvopastoral system with this sort of native system, no, the monte. We are also measuring things related to abundance of species. This is not just the number of species, but the number of individuals of each species. And everything indicates also that the abundance of species is much higher in the intensive silvopastoral system and also in the monte. Why this is relevant? Well, biodiversity is, of course, important for many things, but one specific environmental service associated with diversity is the ecology of disease. And this is a very, very important issue in relation to emergence of new diseases and re-emergence of some of the diseases. These are examples, no? As you see, if you have more diversity, you have less prevalence to many antibodies of different diseases. So basically, the importance of being able to maintain biodiversity in these mega diverse areas of the world or of the tropics is very much related to the One Health approach, to the One Health or One Welfare issue, no? Where you tackle an issue that's related to the environment, but has also relation to human health and to animal health as well. And in relation to gases, well, this is a photograph of another intensive silvopastoral system. This is not in the south, this is in Michoacán, in the central part of Mexico. And basically the same structure. They have the trees or live fences, the grass here, and the shrubs, the leguminous shrubs. This is Leucaena leucocephala. There's a group of nutritionists in the University of Yucatan that have been working for a long time now on different diets, combining different types of legumes and different types of grasses, and relating that to the emission of methane. And they have found that there are several native species of legumes that are related to the reduction in the release of methane, which is very, very interesting from the sort of biology point of view of how different sort of technologies could be developed to reduce, by different type of feeding, the emissions of ruminants in general. But at the end, I think that has a biological limit, and perhaps it could be useful, but it's not really a solution for it. In a way, if we sort of consider also the amount of gases that are captured in this system, not just of those that are released or emitted, this is how carbon storage can be measured in this type of different plants, then it's much more interesting to have this balance, both of the gases that are being released by the animal, but also those gases that are being stored by the system itself. And the balance at the end is much more positive in this type of diverse systems in comparison to the typical monoculture conventional species that we know in the tropics. Okay, so these are examples of some indicators of animal welfare, of the environment, that are sort of feeding this type of tools that I was telling you about. And examples of some of these results. This is a graph of 14 cattle farms, and basically showing these 4 dimensions of the life cycle assessment. And if you see, the farms that scored highest for environmental protection are also those farms that scored highest for animal welfare issues. So in a way, it's telling us that these type of indicators can be reliable, can be useful for this type of tools. Those farms that score low on environmental dimension also score low for animal welfare dimension. This is the SAFA protocol, an example of SAFA. SAFA is a protocol that integrates 4 dimensions: governance, environment, social, and economy. And at the end is like more than 50 indicators. And it releases this type of graphs, like the amoeba type of graphs. And basically, if you see, this is the monoculture, this is the intensive silvopastoral system, this is the native silvopastoral systems, and this is the scores for animal welfare. So you have the dark green is sort of scores higher on animal welfare, and also very similar the score for animal welfare between the intensive silvopastoral system and the monte. And in the case of biodiversity, a similar example. Monoculture, less biodiversity, and the score for biodiversity in the 2 silvopastoral systems is score highest. So it's also an example of how this tool is also being used by feeding it with reliable indicators as well, and specific measurements. Okay, at the end, looking at the big picture of this type of approach, I think it's still how you say, in the initial phase, this type of protocols and this type of indicators that can be used for different dimensions. But at the end, I think there's enough information to say that we need to transform the way we are using these animals, and the way we are sort of developing and developing policy on livestock production. Silvopastoral systems, at least in the tropics in Latin America, seems like a promising type of system that can tackle different issues at the same time. Is leaving this paradigm of more production, more beef, and more, it's basically to talk about the way that it's being produced and the added value of a production on animal welfare and also on the environment. And that's a more useful agenda in a way. But also, we need to tackle issues related to intensive systems, as we were saying. And there are some examples that, for example, in laying hens, there are some trade-offs, The systems with higher welfare, economically better, but then it's also related to more emissions, to greenhouse emissions. Or in the case of organic pig farms, also by Bokkers, this is in the Netherlands, there are some trade-offs between animal welfare and climate change. So I think that in a way there's probably not a perfect system, and that we need to develop a policy based on these trade-offs and considering different types of species, different types of regions in the world, and different types of approaches, but with the idea of integrating it, not just talk about the environmental issues separated from the animal welfare issues and separated from social issues. So at the end, this one welfare approach, so basically is that animal welfare must be considered as part of a sustainability criteria. Any type of livestock production system will be acceptable if people, if society in general accepts it in relation to animal welfare issues. A system can be sustainable if this is acceptable, and also if sort of moral actions are acceptable in relation to the way animals are being used. Not just seeing as sustainability as part of the environment or as part of the sort of efficiency, economic efficiency. Animal welfare has to be a really active part of the global agenda on sustainability. Now, synergies and trade-offs between sustainability criteria must be assessed at a system level, and there are very, very few examples so far on how to do this. And in a way, the pressures, in a way, to form transdisciplinary research in relation to do more science and be able to have better, more efficient policies using sort of good science in a way. So yeah, basically that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so excellent, Dr. Galindo, on time for some questions. But before we start with the questions, I have a paper. If anyone is interested to continue an ongoing conversation with Dr. Francisco Galindo, I have a paper that I can share and people can start writing. So if there's any question.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I'm a representative, the director of Eurogroup for Animals, and we have been considering including the one welfare concept in our strategies. But we have decided not to do it because we think it's, as you also said, it's a very complex concept to use as it stands now as a policy tool. So that was also one of my questions to you. I very much appreciate how you have approached it, and I think it's really impressive how you have tried to quantify it. But how could it be used as a policy tool, and how could it have then also the impact we want to see? Because the OIE is not using, it is maybe adhering to the one welfare concept, but it hasn't implemented it in any of its work. So that was one of my thoughts that came up when I listened to your story. And then secondly, I wondered, I think it's very good that you said at the end we should consider this at a system level, because I'm often very annoyed when I see these researchers that state that extensive farming is more affecting the environment. It's of a negative influence to the environment if we keep animals outdoors. For example, the organic pig study you referred to. But then I think, at what level are you assessing that? Because when we look at the total impact of livestock industries on the environment, then you see a totally different picture. So I would like to hear your views on that as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, very true. In relation to your first question, well, the OIE has organized 4 world conferences now on animal welfare. The last one was 1 year ago here in Mexico, in Guadalajara. And one of the sort of conclusions of the conference was to develop the one welfare agenda. But as you say, this has not been implemented, and so far the OIE has been working in the same way, in the same fashion, just gathering sort of groups of specialists to work specifically on one code of recommendation, on one species, on 4 or 5 systems. It sounds very nice, and it looks very nice in the paper when you say about the one welfare strategy, whatever. But in relation to One Health, I think there have been more progress. There have now been several meetings between WHO, FAO, and OIE in relation to how to develop specific policies on the One Health agenda. And in a way that has been also allowing or pressuring the sort of welfare groups in these 3 organizations There's a very active group in FAO on animal welfare. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Gateway of Animal Welfare by Daniela Battaglia, and she's very much involved in integrating the One Welfare agenda now. No? So I think, in a way, it looks promising. I suppose that in the short term, we could be able to have more sort of shared meetings, no, between these sort of intergovernmental organizations, and be able to draft the beginning of something that is more focusing on specific policies, no, that countries could be implementing to able to advance, no, in the One Welfare agenda. Now, in relation to the other question, I also agree with you that, yeah, sometimes a conclusion of a small study in one small scale, measurement can then be sort of easily transferred to a sort of concept or a global idea, and I think we should be very cautious in doing that. I agree that if we integrate measurement in different scales, then we can be sort of talking about indicators that can really be more reliable in relation to how this specific practice can be impacting the environmental impact or the social impact. But in a way, the policies in most of the countries that have been sort of advancing in sustainability, at least, are related to incentives for farmers, no? Incentives for small producers in many cases, sometimes not small producers, no? But at the end is at the producer level. No? So I think that measurements at that scale, at that sort of system level, will be able to give us more tools, simple but objective tools that can be transferred that to incentive schemes that are based on this sort of effort that the farmer is doing at the local level. Most of the in the case of Yucatan, most of the small producers in the south of Mexico that have still these sort of systems based on forests, it's because they don't have the money to cut it, no, basically, and they are not aware that they have sort of this amazing, resource there that can eventually translate into an incentive scheme and eventually also into labeling, no, and be able to differentiate between different products. So yeah, I think not just to do these sort of large-scale studies, but also at the small-scale unit farm can be useful, specifically to be able to have tools and be able to have incentive schemes that are successful or efficient. Yeah, I don't know if I answer your question.
Okay, we need to finish this session, so thank you, Dr. Francisco Galindo, and
Gracias.
for your presentation. So now it's time for a coffee break, and at 5 will be the panel session.